Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. So first things first, the reason that my makeup is a little bit extra today than it normally is because I am currently filming during show week. I'm currently in a production of Oliver. It's with my amateur dramatic society and I am going to be going into the theatre every day this week, or at least at the time of filming, and I personally do not like having to do my makeup in the theatre. I much prefer to do it at home, which is why you've got me with false eyelashes on. Look at you. I swear it doesn't look this crazy actually on stage under stage lights. But yeah, if you have a few videos from me with this makeup on, that is why. But today I am back to talk about 5 books which became favourites, not the first time that I read them, but on a reread. I noticed there's a lot of media where the first time I watch it, I don't really get it. I'm kind of like, I don't get why everybody likes this thing. But there's still something that calls out to me about that media, whether it be a book, a TV show, a film. I can think of a number of things where the first time that I watched it or read it, I was kind of like, or maybe I even hated the thing, but then I went back to it maybe a couple of months later and then suddenly got hooked onto it. This happened for me with Game of Thrones. I think I watched the first 5 episodes of Game of Thrones and I was like, not for me, too violent, can't be dealing with this. But there was just something about the premise of the show, something about the characters that still drew me in. I went back to it about 6 months later and now here I am today, absolutely obsessed with Game of Thrones. The same thing happened with the Disney movie Tangled. The first time I watched it, I was like, I don't really see what the hype is on this. The second time I watched it, I was like, oh my god, this is now my personality. Also, same thing happened with Hamilton, the musical. The first time I listened to it, I was like, this is a bit different. I'm not really into hip hop and rap, so I'm not sure. But then the second time through, I was so captivated by how clever it is. And you know, fast forward a few years and I'm writing my dissertation partially on Hamilton. And there are definitely books that also holds true for. Well, the first time I read them, I just didn't quite get it. But then the second time through, I was like, this is genius. And so I'm going to talk about these today, going in order of the ones that I changed my opinion on the least. So maybe I kind of liked the book the first time and then it became a favourite. So, you know, it was a slight increase in affection, but my initial opinions were, yeah, this is fine. All the way up to a book that I hated the first time I read it and then loved the second time I read it. The first book to talk to you about today, the one that I, quite liked when I first read it, but maybe didn't quite get it, and then on a second time through loved it, is actually, surprisingly, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I feel like this one was a case of me just reading it a bit too young the first time around. I've mentioned before that I was a big reader through primary school and for the first few years of secondary school, but around about my GCSE, so around the age of 14, my reading took a real nosedive. I barely read anything for about 4 years in secondary school, and I think as a result of that, my reading comprehension was quite down. Like, not to a worrying degree, but definitely I would notice myself needing a little bit more time to mull books over, and it took me a long time to read things because I just wasn't in the habit. So that combined with pressure to read like these big classics, things like Pride and Prejudice or Jane Eyre, that you're told at school that you absolutely must read before you leave, I felt like I was reading Pride and Prejudice more out of obligation rather than because I really had a desperate need to read it. And so the first time I read it, I quite liked it. I thought, yeah, this is fine. I think more so I liked the idea of me being seen reading Pride and Prejudice more so than I was actually enjoying the experience, because honestly, I don't think I took much of it in. I'd never seen any media to do with Pride and Prejudice. Like, I hadn't seen the BBC miniseries, I hadn't seen the film, and I honestly think that adaptations are such a great way of getting people into classic works initially. It can just provide a lot of context for you that you don't necessarily get when you're just first reading it. So yeah, I read Pride and Prejudice. I kind of got the gist of the plot, kind of got a sense of these characters, but it didn't really seep into my soul in the way that it has now. I came back to it a few years later, around about university, and fell in love, and just life has never been the same again. I probably reread the book every year. The 2005 film and the 1995 miniseries is on constant rotation in my house. And I think it's just a reminder to myself that just because something is a classic and is something that everybody tells you that you should read doesn't mean that you have to read it right now. And maybe now isn't always the best time to read something. Maybe you just have to wait a little while. I feel like for myself, I'm very much a mood reader, and when I know that I'm ready for a book, I know. And I just shouldn't doubt myself on that. The next book is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Once again, it wasn't that I disliked this book, but I read this for the first time around October of 2019. This was just as the big Greek myth retelling resurgence was going on. I think Circe had just come out, 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes had just come out, and I'd read 1,000 Ships and really enjoyed it. I actually took classical civilization for A-level, so I felt fairly comfortable with some of these figures, but I wasn't anywhere near as obsessed with Greek mythology as I feel like I am now. And hot off of reading Circe and liking it, because I'd seen so much hype for the Song of Achilles, and because it was by the same author, I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. Even though, to be honest, at the time, my knowledge of the Trojan War was kind of slim. I just felt like I didn't have any sort of kinship with these characters, and I didn't feel quite as invested. I just wasn't quite there when I read it. And I was reading it thinking, yes, Madeline Miller is a very talented writer. I see what she's doing, but it's just not doing anything for me right now. So I DNF'd it around about 100 pages. I put it to the side. Then fast forward to May 2020, I start my YouTube channel. I start making friends with fellow bookish content creators. And I was watching a video from Sylvie over at the TBR Diaries, who also started around the same time as me. And she did a really great video where she was talking about, I think it was 10 books that she wanted to reread. And she positively gushed about the Song of Achilles and how amazing it was, how heartbreaking it was. And I think within about 24 hours of that, another one of my friends mentioned how much she loved the Song of Achilles and how it made her cry. And I thought, something was just nagging at me. There's just something in my mind that thought, maybe you need to give that another go. Also, during 2020, while we were in lockdown, I was reading a lot more Greek myth retelling, and I felt like I was a bit more comfortable with the Trojan War and with the chronology of events. And so I went back to the Song of Achilles, and yeah, I cried. I did cry. And now we're at the point where I do regularly reread this book, and every single time I get to the end, I just start weeping. Whether it's physically reading it, whether it's an audiobook. There was one notable occasion where I was downstairs in my office's post room, franking a parcel, and I got to the very end of the audiobook and I was just crying over the post. So yes, needless to say, my opinions on it are very different now. The next book is one that you will have seen my journey play out in real time while I was on YouTube, and that was with Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. My Hamnet review, which I did right at the start of my channel, is actually one of my most popular videos because of the fact that I was kind of ambivalent towards Hamnet. Once again, recognising Maggie O'Farrell's talent as a writer, seeing what she was trying to do. But at the time of reading Hamnet, I was reading quite a lot of historical fiction, and I had a string of back-to-back misses with historical fiction authors using this trope, which you know that I hate, which is the witchy wise woman trope, which for me is a very lazy historical fiction trope in which an author is trying to convey that a female character is different to everybody else in her town, and the only way that the author seems to know how to do that, how to characterize that, is by making her witchy. This annoys me, and especially annoys me in comparison to all of the other silly girls in the town who are just ordinary. They do not have this witchiness, and therefore they are not worthy as women, and it drives me insane. And so here I was reading Hamnet, reading this characterization of Anne Hathaway, or Agnes as she is known in Hamnet, and once again she was being described as witchy, being different to everybody in the town, and it just rubbed me up so the wrong way, because it was like, ah yes, how are we going to possibly show that William Shakespeare might be interested in a woman? Well, it must be because she's different to the other girls. And how do we show that she's different? Well, let's make her witchy. And yeah, that really tainted my experience of the first time reading this book, and I felt like while I was reading it I couldn't take anything else in. I was just so bitter. And actually my reread of Hamnet came not long after the first read. I think it was about a month. I read it for the first time in April 2020, and I didn't even mention it in my April wrap-up because I just knew I hadn't settled my thoughts on it. And so around about May, June of 2020, I went back and I reread it, and I had such a better experience of it, trying to be a little bit more objective, trying to get out of my own brain and just really evaluate what Maggie O'Farrell is doing and really try and appreciate it without all of my preconceived notions in there. And what I found in there was a really gutting, devastating book where she is using this trope of the witchy wise woman, yes, but I feel like she was using it in a clever way. I will link below my Hamnet review for more fuller thoughts on this, but honestly, the more times that I've come back to Hamnet, the more that I appreciate it, the more I actually think it's become one of my favourite books, like much more so than it did on the reread in 2020. I actually went to see the RSC's production of it in Stratford-upon-Avon and just really fell in love with the story all over again. It had been a good 3 years since I'd encountered it, and actually because I'm doing a little Shakespeare project, I'm re-listening to the audiobook now, and yeah, the more I come back to this, the more I love it. Will it become a favourite book of all time? I don't know yet. I'm not quite done with that. But yeah, I have much better feelings about Hamnet now. The penultimate book on this list, once again, one that you will have seen my journey with. You won't have seen the first time that I read this, but you may have seen a video that I did about this book where I did not say very flattering things about it and then very quickly changed my tune upon a reread. And that book is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. So I read this for the first time, I want to say September of 2019. I didn't really know very much about North and South, and actually the only person who I'd ever heard talk about it was somebody who didn't really like like the book. So that wasn't a great start to reading this for the first time. Also, because I knew that this book was kind of about the north-south divide in England, and I knew it was about a southern girl who comes up to a fictional northern town and instantly takes a dislike to the town. As somebody who's from the north of England myself, I found myself instantly getting very defensive. So pretty much any time that Margaret Hale would say something bad about the north, I'd be like, why I order? But that wasn't actually really what left the bitter taste in my mouth about this book. It was actually the fact that during the course of reading the book, I was also simultaneously watching the, I think it's 2004 BBC miniseries, which stars Richard Armitage as John Thornton, the love interest. I was pretty much reading a few chapters of the book and then instantly watching that episode of the show, which was kind of the wrong thing to do, I think, because there is a scene in the BBC miniseries when we are first introducing the character of John Thornton, as played by Richard Armitage. And seriously, this is my one complaint with the BBC miniseries, because actually, having gone back and watched it now, I really, really enjoy it. And it is that the introduction of the character of John Thornton is him beating up a worker, which we find out is because that worker was smoking and therefore endangering the rest of the employees. And I just have to say, I'm a very non-violent person. Seeing any sort of violence really, really upsets me. And so I just couldn't get over the fact that the introduction to this love interest is him beating somebody up, and then we're meant to root for this man. I couldn't do it. But crucially, as far as the book is concerned, that scene where John Thornton beats up a worker is in the BBC miniseries, but it's not in the book. But because I was reading and watching simultaneously, I kind of superimposed that scene from the BBC miniseries into the book. And I actually mention it in my All the Victorian Books That I've Read video, once again, I will link down below, that the reason that I couldn't get over this book and I couldn't bring myself to like it is because I just thought I can't root for a hero who is violent, who beats people up. I can't do it. And it wasn't until October of 2020 that I actually went back and reread North and South, because I read Wives and Daughters and really loved it. And so I thought, oh, there must be something wrong with me. There must be a reason that I didn't like North and South. Maybe I just need to give it another go. And so I start reading North and South, expecting for this scene to happen. And I was about 16 chapters in. John Thornton was well and truly integrated into the narrative, and he still hadn't beat up a worker. And I was like, what's going on? What's happening? And lo and behold, I discover, oh, I was just wrong. I was just fully incorrect about what happened in this book. And yeah, I felt very silly. I felt really, really silly, because as I progressed on with North and South, I loved it and ended up really, really loving John Thornton as a character. Definitely my favourite character in the book. So yeah, that was quite a sharp turn. But once again, a book that I return to now every Victober, and I really love it. And then the final book that improved on a reread for me, probably the one that improved the most on a reread, was Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. You might be surprised to learn that the first time that I tried to pick up Wolf Hall, I actually DNF'd it around about 150 pages. And the reason for this is because, once again, because of preconceived notions, because of existing biases that I had. So when I was at university, I studied history, and for your third year, you end up specialising in one particular topic over the course of the entire year. And the special subject that I was assigned to in my third year was actually Thomas More, who was High Chancellor for Henry VIII, the author of Utopia, and famously, in the context of Wolf Hall, kind of an enemy of our protagonist, Thomas Cromwell. And as a result of his conscience not letting him sign the oath of supremacy under Henry VIII, he ended up being executed and is seen as a real Catholic martyr as a result of the Reformation in England. And typically in most media, especially in the famous play and film A Man for All Seasons, Thomas More is usually portrayed as a martyr, as a good person, as the hero to Cromwell's villain. And so that was kind of the preconceived notion that I was taking to Wolf Hall, was Thomas More hero, Thomas Cromwell villain. But of course in Wolf Hall, Hilary Mantel completely turns that on its head, and instead we have Thomas Cromwell as the hero and Thomas More as the villain. And it just, I don't know, it just made me uncomfortable. I didn't like it. There was just so much in me that was like, this is not right. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't get over it. It was just too sharp a turn for me. And so when I originally read it, I ended up putting it down because I was like, no, no, I can't. It's a betrayal of everything I believe in, everything I've been taught. But then of course, fast forward to 2020, when The Mirror and the Light, the final book in this trilogy, comes out, I'm hearing so many people's glowing reviews of the series. And of course, I am a big Tudor fan. I just felt like I could not ignore this massive pillar of historical fiction that is about the Tudors. How could I call myself a Tudor fan if I've not been able to get through Wolf Hall? And so I start reading it again and trying to put away all of those initial thoughts, and I loved it. I just loved being able to see the Tudor court through Cromwell's worldview, seeing the way that Hilary Mantel is able to so masterfully weave this web, create this atmosphere. It is some of the most atmospheric writing I've ever read. And by the end of The Mirror and the Light, I found myself crying for Thomas Cromwell of all people. It was too much for me. So if that's not a sharp improvement on a reread, I don't know what is. So there we go. Those are 5 books that ended up improving on a reread and becoming new favourites. Please let me know if you also have this issue, where the first time you read it, something in your brain just can't cope. I think there's just something in me that recognises, oh, this book is about to change your life, and just instantly rejects it. But thank goodness there's a little spark in there that is like, no, maybe you need to go back to that. Maybe you need to give that a second chance and be a little bit more open-minded. Thank goodness I have that. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.